Today we continue exploring communion and the teaching that God gives His people from Genesis to Revelation throughout the Bible. And we remember that in Judaism, bread is equivalent to meal, and to life, is the sustaining of life, because it was the staple food. And even today in Israel, any meal that is without bread is not counted as a meal in Judaism. And now God offered manna, we saw, to His people, but we want to look at now bread and its importance in the worship. God planned that there will be bread in His presence always, in the tabernacle in the desert, and then later on in the temple. He gave specific instructions on how to bake that bread, and there was one loaf for every tribe, and those loaves were brought to the temple in God's presence, in His presence, on a special table. And the loaves were left there and changed every Sabbath. And those that were removed were eaten by the priests. And so we can see that bread was intimately linked with the presence of God, so much that it was called the bread of the presence. There was always bread in God's presence, and it symbolizes God feeding His people. God bread. And that was eventually taken again by Jesus when he told in John chapter 6, I'm the bread of life, but we talk about it later. Now, another thing we want to look at in Jesus' life is His relationship to bread. 2 times it is recorded in Matthew chapter 14 and Matthew chapter 15 that He fed the whole multitude that had come to listen to His teaching, to be healed and prayed for. They stayed and overstayed, and at a point Jesus said they must be hungry. But in both cases there was no food around. There was no shop, obviously, there was no market. It was in the middle of nowhere. And in both cases, Jesus took a little snack that was in the hands of someone and multiplied the bread. In the first case, He fed 5,000 people, men only, and the women and the children that were there were also fed, but they were not counted because that was the tradition. In the second case, He fed 4,000 men and uncounted women and children. And that was just a symbol, a physical token of what He could do, what He alone could feed people with. That taking bread, that essential piece of food, He showed people that in Him there is plenty. In Him there is plenitude. You don't lack in His presence. He is able to feed you. And Jesus has a very good relationship with food. And we see in the Gospels that He was often invited by people. And whoever was inviting Him, He never turned it down. He never turned the invitation down. He went. And in fact, He was classified as a glutton by some people because they always saw Him feasting with Pharisees, with all kinds of people. Certainly not the holy ones. but anyone that invited him. And for him, the food was, the meal was a way of introducing himself to people. He used food time to talk, and people listened. Because when you invite someone, you will not refuse to listen to him. And so for him, the meal, the shared meal, was a very, very important part of life. And we can see also that at Bethany with Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And Martha was so conscious of that, that she spent time in the kitchen, so much that Jesus had to reprimand her one time and say, come on, just relax and sit down with us before the meal. And so it's something that we have to realize, that Jesus wants us to know that his presence is food and drink. Just like Proverbs talks about bread and wine, the essential. That is what God supplies. And all these were bringing people to understand better how Jesus is going to give them life. We see another time about John chapter 6.